Operational parameters such as oil pressure are adjustable on each of Terramer's vehicles to increase the I-option's R efficiency, depending on their environmental conditions. Your primary goal is to increase the operating efficiency of all 20 million cellular and unconnected vehicles in the field. How can you accomplish this goal? Option A. Have you engineers inspect the data for patterns and then create an algorithm with rules that make operational adjustments automatically. Option B. Capture all operating data, train machine learning models that identify ideal operations, and run locally to make operational adjustments automatically. Option C. Implement a Google Cloud Dataflow streaming job with a sliding window, and use Google Cloud Messaging (GCM) to make operational adjustments automatically. Option D. Capture all operating data, train machine learning models that identify ideal operations, and host in Google Cloud Machine Learning (ML) platform to make operational adjustments automatically. Your company has just acquired another company, and you have been asked to integrate their existing Google Cloud environment into your company's data center. Upon investigation, you discover that some of the RFC 1918 IP ranges being used in the new company's Virtual Private Cloud (VPC) overlap with your data center IP space. What should you do to enable connectivity and make sure that there are no routing conflicts when connectivity is established? Option A. Create a cloud VPN connection from the new VPC to the data center. Create a cloud router and apply new IP addresses so there is no overlapping IP space. Option B. Create a cloud VPN connection from the new VPC to the data center and create a Cloud NAT instance to perform NAT on the overlapping IP space. Option C. Create a cloud VPN connection from the new VPC to the data center, create a cloud router, and apply a custom route advertisement to block the overlapping IP space. Option D. Create a cloud VPN connection from the new VPC to the data center and apply a firewall rule that blocks the overlapping IP space. You are working at a sports association whose members range in age from 8 to 30. The association collects a large amount of health data, such as sustained injuries. You are storing this data in BigQuery. Current legislation requires you to delete such information upon request of the subject. You want to design a solution that can accommodate such a request. What should you do? Option A. Use a unique identifier for each individual. Upon a deletion request, delete all rows from BigQuery with this identifier. Option B. When ingesting new data in BigQuery, run the data through the Data Loss Prevention (DLP) API to identify any personal information. As part of the DLP scan, save the result to Data Catalog. Upon a deletion request, query Data Catalog to find the column with personal information. Option C. Create a BigQuery view over the table that contains all data. Upon a deletion request, exclude the rows that affect the subject's data from this view. Use this view instead of the source table for all analysis tasks. Option D. Use a unique identifier for each individual. Upon a deletion request, overwrite the column with the unique identifier with a salted SHA 256 of its value. You are deploying an application on App Engine that needs to integrate with an on-premises database. For security purposes, your on-premises database must not be accessible through the public internet. What should you do? Option A. Deploy your application on App Engine standard environment and use App Engine firewall rules to limit access to the open on-premises database. Option B. Deploy your application on App Engine standard environment and use Cloud VPN to limit access to the on-premises database. Option C. Deploy your application on App Engine flexible environment and use App Engine firewall rules to limit access to the on-premises database. Option D. Deploy your application on App Engine flexible environment and use Cloud VPN to limit access to the on-premises database. Your company places a high value on being responsive and meeting customer needs quickly. Their primary business objectives are release speed and agility. You want to reduce the chance of security errors being accidentally introduced. Which two actions can you take? Choose two. Option A. Ensure every code check-in is peer-reviewed by a security SME. Option B. Use source code security analyzers as part of the CI/CD pipeline. Option C. Ensure you have stubs to unit test all interfaces between components. Option D. Enable code signing and a trusted binary repository integrated with your CI/CD pipeline. Option E. Run a vulnerability security scanner as part of your continuous integration, continuous-delivery CI/CD pipeline. Mount Kirk Games gaming servers are not automatically scaling properly. Last month, they rolled out a new feature, which suddenly became very popular. A record number of users are trying to use the service, but many of them are getting 503 errors and very slow response times. What should they investigate first? Option A. Verify that the database is online. Option B. Verify that the project quota hasn't been exceeded. Option C. Verify that the new feature code did not introduce any performance bugs. Option D. Verify that the load testing team is not running their tool against production. Your company wants to migrate their 10 TB on-premises database export into cloud storage. You want to minimize the time it takes to complete this activity, the overall cost, and database load. The bandwidth between the on-premises environment and Google Cloud is 1 gigabit per second. You want to follow Google recommended practices. What should you do? Option A. Develop a Dataflow job to read data directly from the database and write it into cloud storage. Option B. Use the data transfer appliance to perform an offline migration. Option C. Use a commercial partner ETL solution to extract the data from the on-premises database and upload it into cloud storage. Option D. Compress the data and upload it with G-SUTIL-M to enable multi-threaded copy. Your development team has installed a new Linux kernel module on the batch servers in Google Compute Engine (GCE) virtual machines (VMs) to speed up the nightly batch process. 2 days after the installation, 50% of the batch servers failed the nightly batch run. You want to collect details on the failure to pass back to the development team. Which 3 actions should you take? Choose 3. Option A. Use Stackdriver logging to search for the module log entries. Option B. Read the debug GCE activity log using the API or Cloud Console. Option C. Use GA Cloud or Cloud Console to connect to the Serial Console and observe the logs. Option D. Identify whether a live migration event of the failed server occurred using in the activity log. Option E. Adjust the Google Stackdriver timeline to match the failure time and observe the batch server metrics. Option F. Export a debug VM into an image and run the image on a local server where kernel log messages will be displayed on the native screen. A lead engineer wrote a custom tool that deploys virtual machines in the legacy data center. He wants to migrate the custom tool to the new cloud environment. You want to advocate for the adoption of Google Cloud Deployment Manager. What are 2 business risks of migrating to Cloud Deployment Manager? Choose 2. Option A. Cloud Deployment Manager uses Python. Option B. Cloud Deployment Manager APIs could be deprecated in the future. Option C. Cloud Deployment Manager is unfamiliar to the company's engineers. Option D. Cloud Deployment Manager requires a Google API's service account to run. Option E. Cloud Deployment Manager can be used to permanently delete cloud resources. Option F. Cloud Deployment Manager only supports automation of Google Cloud resources. Your company has decided to make a major revision of their API in order to create better experiences for their developers. They need to keep the old version of the API available and deployable, while allowing new customers and testers to try out the new API. They want to keep the same SSL and DNS records in place to serve both APIs. What should they do? Option A. Configure a new load balancer for the new version of the API. Option B. Reconfigure old clients to use a new endpoint for the new API. Option C. Have the old API forward traffic to the new API based on the path. Option D. Use separate backend pools for each API path behind the load balancer. For this question, refer to the Terram Earth case study. You are building a microservice-based application for Terram Earth. The application is based on Docker containers. You want to follow Google recommended practices to build the application continuously and store the build artifacts. What should you do? Option A. Configure a trigger in Cloud Build for new source changes. Invoke Cloud Build to build container images for each microservice and tag them using the code commit hash. Push the images to the container registry. Option B. Configure a trigger in Cloud Build for new source changes. The trigger invokes build jobs and build container images for the microservices. Tag the images with a version number and push them to cloud storage. Option C. Create a scheduler job to check the repo every minute. For any new change, invoke Cloud Build to build container images for the microservices. Tag the images using the current timestamp and push them to the container registry. Option D. Configure a trigger in Cloud Build for new source changes. Invoke Cloud Build to build one container image and tag the image with the label latest. Push the image to the container registry. For this question, refer to the Terram Earth case study. You have broken down a legacy monolithic application into a few containerized, RESTful microservices. You want to run those microservices on Cloud Run. You also want to make sure the services are highly available with low latency to your customers. What should you do? Option A. Deploy Cloud Run services to multiple availability zones. Create cloud endpoints that point to the services. Create a global HTTPS load balancing instance and attach the cloud endpoints to its backend. Option B. Deploy Cloud Run services to multiple regions. Create serverless network endpoint groups pointing to the services. Add the serverless NEGs to a backend service that is used by a global HTTPS load balancing instance. Option C. Deploy Cloud Run services to multiple regions. In Cloud DNS, create a latency-based DNS name that points to the services. Option D. Deploy Cloud Run services to multiple availability zones. Create a TCP/IP global load balancer. Add the Cloud Run endpoints to its backend service. For this question, refer to the Tarim Earth case study. You start to build a new application that uses a few cloud functions for the backend. One use case requires a cloud function func_display to invoke another cloud function func_query. You want func_query only to accept invocations from func_display. You also want to follow Google's recommended best practices. What should you do? Option A. Create a token and pass it in as an environment variable to func_display. When invoking func_query, include the token in the request. Pass the same token to func_query and reject the invocation if the tokens are different. Option B. Make func_query require authentication. Create a unique service account and associate it to func_display. Grant the service account invoker role for func_query. Create an ID token in func_display and include the token to the request when invoking func_query. Option C. Make func_query require authentication and only accept internal traffic. Create those two functions in the same VPC. Create an ingress firewall rule for func_query to only allow traffic from func_display. Option D. Create those two functions in the same project and VPC. Make func_query only accept internal traffic. Create an ingress firewall for func_query to only allow traffic from func_display. Also, make sure both functions use the same service account. Your development team has created a mobile game app. You want to test the new mobile app on Android and iOS devices with a variety of configurations. You need to ensure that testing is efficient and cost-effective. What should you do? Option A. Upload your mobile app to the Firebase Test Lab and test the mobile app on Android and iOS devices. Option B. Create Android and iOS VMs on Google Cloud. Install the mobile app on the VMs and test the mobile app. Option C. Create Android and iOS containers on Google Kubernetes Engine, GKE. Install the mobile app on the containers and test the mobile app. Option D. Upload your mobile app with different configurations to Firebase hosting and test each configuration. Your development teams release new versions of games running on Google Kubernetes Engine, GKE, daily. You want to create service-level indicators, SLIs, to evaluate the quality of the new versions from the user's perspective. What should you do? Option A. Create CPU utilization and request latency as service-level indicators. Option B. Create GKE CPU utilization and memory utilization as service-level indicators. Option C. Create request latency and error rate as service-level indicators. Option D. Create server uptime and error rate as service-level indicators. Mount Kirk Games wants to limit the physical location of resources to their operating Google Cloud regions. What should you do? Option A. Configure an organizational policy which constrains where resources can be deployed. Option B. Configure IAM conditions to limit what resources can be configured. Option C. Configure the quotas for resources in the regions not being used to 0. Option D. Configure a custom alert in Cloud Monitoring so you can disable resources as they are created in other regions. You are implementing Firestore for Mount Kirk Games. Mount Kirk Games wants to give a new game programmatic access to a legacy games Firestore database. Access should be as restricted as possible. What should you do? Option A. Create a service account, SA, in the Legacy Games Google Cloud project. Add a second SA in the New Games IAM page, and then give the organization admin role to both SAs. Option B. Create a service account, SA, in the Legacy Games Google Cloud project. Give the SA the organization admin role, and then give it the Firebase admin role in both projects. Option C. Create a service account, SA, in the Legacy Games Google Cloud project. Add this SA in the New Games IAM page, and then give it the Firebase admin role in both projects. Option D. Create a service account, SA, in the Legacy Games Google Cloud project. Give it the Firebase admin role, and then migrate the new game to the Legacy Games project. You need to optimize batch file transfers into cloud storage for Mount Kirk Games' new Google Cloud solution. The batch files contain game statistics that need to be staged in cloud storage and be processed by an extract transform load (ETL) tool. What should you do? Option A. Use gsutil to batch move files in sequence. Option B. Use gsutil to batch copy the files in parallel. Option C. Use gsutil to extract the files as the first part of ETL. Option D. Use gsutil to load the files as the last part of ETL. For this question, refer to the EHR Healthcare case study. In the past, configuration errors put public IP addresses on back-end servers that should not have been accessible from the Internet. You need to ensure that no one can put external IP addresses on back-end compute engine instances, and that external IP addresses can only be configured on front-end compute engine instances. What should you do? Option A. Create an organizational policy with a constraint to allow external IP addresses only on the front-end compute engine instances. Option B. Revoke the compute network admin role from all users in the project with front-end instances. Option C. Create an identity and access management (IAM) policy that maps the IT staff to the compute network admin role for the organization. Option D. Create a custom identity and access management (IAM) role named GCE_frontend with the compute addresses. Create permission. For this question, refer to the EHR Healthcare case study. You are a developer on the EHR Customer Portal team. Your team recently migrated the Customer Portal application to Google Cloud. The load has increased on the application servers, and now the application is logging many timeout errors. You recently incorporated PubSub into the application architecture, and the application is not logging any PubSub publishing errors. You want to improve publishing latency. What should you do? Option A. Increase the PubSub total timeout retry value. Option B. Move from a PubSub subscriber pull model to a push model. Option C. Turn off PubSub message batching. Option D. Create a backup PubSub message queue. You need to upgrade the EHR connection to comply with their requirements. The new connection design must support business-critical needs and meet the same network and security policy requirements. What should you do? Option A. Add a new dedicated interconnect connection. Option B. Upgrade the bandwidth on the dedicated interconnect connection to 100G. Option C. Add 3 new Cloud VPN connections. Option D. Add a new carrier peering connection. For this question, refer to the Helicopter Racing League (HRL) Case study. A recent finance audit of cloud infrastructure noted an exceptionally high number of compute engine instances are allocated to do video encoding and transcoding. You suspect that these virtual machines are zombie machines that were not deleted after their workloads completed. You need to quickly get a list of which VM instances are idle. What should you do? Option A. Log into each compute engine instance and collect disk, CPU, memory, and network usage statistics for analysis. Option B. Use the gCloud Compute Instances list to list the virtual machine instances that have the idle, true label set. Option C. Use the gCloud Recommender command to list the idle virtual machine instances. Option D. From the Google console, identify which compute engine instances in the managed instance groups are no longer responding to health check probes. For this question, refer to the Helicopter Racing League (HRL) case study. HRL is looking for a cost-effective approach for storing their race data, such as telemetry. They want to keep all historical records, train models using only the previous season's data, and plan for data growth in terms of volume and information collected. You need to propose a data solution. Considering HRL business requirements and the goals expressed by CEOS Hawk, what should you do? Option A. Use Firestore for its scalable and flexible document-based database. Use collections to aggregate race data by season and event. Option B. Use Cloud Spanner for its scalability and ability to version schemas with zero downtime. Split race data using season as a primary key. Option C. Use BigQuery for its scalability and ability to add columns to a schema. Partition race data based on season. Option D. Use Cloud SQL for its ability to automatically manage storage increases and compatibility with MySQL. Use separate database instances for each season. For this question, refer to the Helicopter Racing League (HRL) case study. The HRL development team releases a new version of their predictive capability application every Tuesday evening at 3 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time to a repository. The security team at HRL has developed an in-house penetration test cloud function called Airwolf. The security team wants to run Airwolf against the predictive capability application as soon as it is released every Tuesday. You need to set up Airwolf to run at the recurring weekly cadence. What should you do? Option A. Set up cloud tasks and a cloud storage bucket that triggers a cloud function. Option B. Set up a cloud logging sync and a cloud storage bucket that triggers a cloud function. Option C. Configure the deployment job to notify a pub subqueue that triggers a cloud function. Option D. Set up identity and access management (IAM) and confidential computing to trigger a cloud function. You are working at a financial institution that stores mortgage loan approval documents on cloud storage. Any change to these approval documents must be uploaded as a separate approval file. You need to ensure that these documents cannot be deleted or overwritten for the next 5 years. What should you do? Option A. Create a retention policy on the bucket for the duration of 5 years. Create a lock on the retention policy. Option B. Create a retention policy organizational constraint. Constraints/storage. Retention policy seconds at the organization level. Set the duration to 5 years. Option C. Use a customer-managed key for the encryption of the bucket. Rotate the key after 5 years. Option D. Create a retention policy organizational constraint. Constraint/storage. Retention policy seconds at the project level. Set the duration to 5 years. Your company wants to migrate their 10 TB on-premises database export into cloud storage. You want to minimize the time it takes to complete this activity and the overall cost. The bandwidth between the on-premises environment and Google Cloud is 1 gigabit per second. You want to follow Google recommended practices. What should you do? Option A. Develop a Dataflow job to read data directly from the database and write it into cloud storage. Option B. Use the data transfer appliance to perform an offline migration. Option C. Use a commercial partner ETL solution to extract the data from the on-premises database and upload it into cloud storage. Option D. Upload the data with Kali Cloud Storage CP. You are deploying an application to Google Cloud. The application is part of a system. The application in Google Cloud must communicate over a private network with applications in a non-Google Cloud environment. The expected average throughput is 200 kilobits per second. The business requires as close to 100% system availability as possible cost optimization. You need to design the connectivity between the locations to meet the business requirements. What should you provision? Option A. An HA Cloud VPN gateway connected with 2 tunnels to an on-premises VPN gateway. Option B. 2 classic Cloud VPN gateways connected to 2 on-premises VPN gateways. Configure each classic Cloud VPN gateway to have 2 tunnels, each connected to different on-premises VPN gateways. Option C. 2 HA Cloud VPN gateways connected to 2 on-premises VPN gateways. Configure each HA Cloud VPN gateway to have 2 tunnels, each connected to different on-premises VPN gateways. Option D. A single Cloud VPN gateway connected to an on-premises VPN gateway. You have a compute engine application that you want to autoscale when total memory usage exceeds 80%. You have installed the Cloud Monitoring Agent and configured the autoscaling policy as follows. Metric identifier agent.googleapis.com/memory/%_used filter. Metrics label. State equals used target utilization level. 80 target type. Gauge. You observe that the application does not scale under high load. You want to resolve this. What should you do? Option A. Change the target type to delta_per_minute. Option B. Change the metric identifier to agent.googleapis.com/memory/bytes_used. Option C. Change the filter to metric label. State equals used and metric label. State equals buffered and metric label. State equals cached and metric label. State equals slab. Option D. Change the filter to metric label. State equals free and the target utilization to 20. Your company and one of its partners each have a Google Cloud project in separate organizations. Your company's project, PRJ, runs in Virtual Private Cloud, VPC. The partner's project, PRJB, runs in VPCB. There are 2 instances running on VPC and 1 instance running on VPCB. Subnets defined in both VPCs are not overlapping. You need to ensure that all instances communicate with each other via internal IPs, minimizing latency and maximizing throughput. What should you do? Option A. Set up a network peering between VPC-A and VPC-B. Option B. Set up a VPN between VPC and VPC-B using Cloud VPN. Option C. Configure IAP-TCP forwarding on the instance in VPCB, and then launch the following gcloud command from one of the instances in VPC A Cloud. gcloud compute start, IAP tunnel instance _ name _ IN _ VPC _ 822. Local host port equals localhost 22. Option D. 1. Create an additional instance in VPCA. 2. Create an additional instance in VPCB. 3. Install OpenVPN in newly created instances. 4. Configure a VPN tunnel between VPC and VPCB with the help of OpenVPN. Your company uses Google Kubernetes Engine (GKE) as a platform for all workloads. Your company has a single large GKE cluster that contains batch, stateful, and stateless workloads. The GKE cluster is configured with a single node pool with 200 nodes. Your company needs to reduce the cost of this cluster, but does not want to compromise availability. What should you do? Option A. Create a second GKE cluster for the batch workloads only. Allocate the 200 original nodes across both clusters. Option B. Configure CPU and memory limits on the namespaces in the cluster. Configure all pods to have a CPU and memory limits. Option C. Configure a horizontal pod autoscaler for all stateless workloads and for all compatible stateful workloads. Configure the cluster to use node autoscaling. Option D. Change the node pool to use preemptible VMs. Your company has decided to build a backup replica of their on-premises user authentication PostgreSQL database on Google Cloud Platform. The database is 4 terabytes and large updates are frequent. Replication requires private address space communication. Which networking approach should you use? Option A. Google Cloud Dedicated Interconnect. Option B. Google Cloud VPN connected to the data center network. Option C. A NAT and TLS translation gateway installed on-premises. Option D. A Google Compute Engine instance with a VPN server installed connected to the data center network. Your company has an application that is running on multiple instances of Compute Engine. It generates 1 terabyte per day of logs. For compliance reasons, the logs need to be kept for at least 2 years. The logs need to be available for active query for 30 days. After that, they just need to be retained for audit purposes. You want to implement a storage solution that is compliant, minimizes costs, and follows Google recommended practices. What should you do? You have an application deployed on Google Kubernetes Engine using a deployment named Echo Deployment. The deployment is exposed using a service called Echo Service. You need to perform an update to the application with minimal downtime to the application. What should you do? Option A. Use kubect-l set image deployment. Echo deployment less than new image greater than. Option B. Use the rolling update functionality of the instance group behind the Kubernetes cluster. Option C. Update the deployment YAML file with the new container image. Use kubect-l delete deployment / echo deployment and kubect-l create a euro-f less than YAML file greater than. Option D. Update the service YAML file with the new container image. Use kubect-l delete service / echo service and kubect-l create a euro-f less than YAML file greater than. The operations manager asks you for a list of recommended practices that she should consider when migrating a J2EE application to the cloud. Which 3 practices should you recommend? Choose 3. Option A. Port the application code to run on Google App Engine. Option B. Integrate Cloud Dataflow into the application to capture real-time metrics. Option C. Instrument the application with a monitoring tool like Stackdriver Debugger. Option D. Select an automation framework to reliably provision the cloud infrastructure. Option E. Deploy a continuous integration tool with automated testing in a staging environment. Option F. Migrate from MySQL to a managed NoSQL database like Google Cloud Data Store or Bigtable. You are monitoring Google Kubernetes Engine (GKE) clusters in a cloud monitoring workspace. As a site reliability engineer (SRE), you need to triage incidents quickly. What should you do? Option A. Navigate the predefined dashboards in the cloud monitoring workspace, and then add metrics and create alert policies. Option B. Navigate the predefined dashboards in the cloud monitoring workspace, create custom metrics, and install alerting software on a compute engine instance. Option C. Write a shell script that gathers metrics from GKE nodes. Publish these metrics to a pub subtopic, export the data to BigQuery, and make a Data Studio dashboard. Option D. Create a custom dashboard in the cloud monitoring workspace for each incident, and then add metrics and create alert policies. An application development team believes their current logging tool will not meet their needs for their new cloud-based product. They want a better tool to capture errors and help them analyze their historical log data. You want to help them find a solution that meets their needs. What should you do? Option A. Direct them to download and install the Google Stackdriver logging agent. Option B. Send them a list of online resources about logging best practices. Option C. Help them define their requirements and assess viable logging tools. Option D. Help them upgrade their current tool to take advantage of any new features. Your company is designing its data lake on Google Cloud and wants to develop different ingestion pipelines to collect unstructured data from different sources. After the data is stored in Google Cloud, it will be processed in several data pipelines to build a recommendation engine for end users on the website. The structure of the data retrieved from the source systems can change at any time. The data must be stored exactly as it was retrieved for reprocessing purposes, in case the data structure is incompatible with the current processing pipelines. You need to design an architecture to support the use case after you retrieve the data. What should you do? Option A. Send the data through the processing pipeline and then store the processed data in a BigQuery table for reprocessing. Option B. Store the data in a BigQuery table. Design the processing pipelines to retrieve the data from the table. Option C. Send the data through the processing pipeline and then store the processed data in a cloud storage bucket for reprocessing. Option D. Store the data in a cloud storage bucket. Design the processing pipelines to retrieve the data from the bucket. One of your primary business objectives is being able to trust the data stored in your application. You want to log all changes to the application data. How can you design your logging system to verify authenticity of your logs? Option A. Write the log concurrently in the cloud and on-premises. Option B. Use a SQL database and limit who can modify the log table. Option C. Digitally sign each timestamp and log entry and store the signature. Option D. Create a JSON dump of each log entry and store it in Google Cloud Storage. Your company is designing its application landscape on Compute Engine. Whenever a zonal outage occurs, the application should be restored in another zone as quickly as possible with the latest application data. You need to design the solution to meet this requirement. What should you do? Option A. Create a snapshot schedule for the disk containing the application data. Whenever a zonal outage occurs, use the latest snapshot to restore the disk in the same zone. Option B. Configure the Compute Engine instances with an instance template for the application, and use a regional persistent disk for the application data. Whenever a zonal outage occurs, use the instance template to spin up the application in another zone in the same region. Use the regional persistent disk for the application data. Option C. Create a snapshot schedule for the disk containing the application data. Whenever a zonal outage occurs, use the latest snapshot to restore the disk in another zone within the same region. Option D. Configure the Compute Engine instances with an instance template for the application, and use a regional persistent disk for the application data. Whenever a zonal outage occurs, use the instance template to spin up the application in another region. Use the regional persistent disk for the application data. You are developing your microservices application on Google Kubernetes Engine. During testing, you want to validate the behavior of your application in case a specific microservice should suddenly crash. What should you do? Option A. Add a taint to one of the nodes of the Kubernetes cluster. For the specific microservice, configure a pod anti-affinity label that has the name of the tainted node as a value. Option B. Use Istio's fault injection on the particular microservice whose faulty behavior you want to simulate. Option C. Destroy one of the nodes of the Kubernetes cluster to observe the behavior. Option D. Configure Istio's traffic management features to steer the traffic away from a crashing microservice. You have deployed several instances on Compute Engine. As a security requirement, instances cannot have a public IP address. There is no VPN connection between Google Cloud and your office, and you need to connect via SSH into a specific machine without violating the security requirements. What should you do? Option A. Configure CloudNAT on the subnet where the instance is hosted. Create an SSH connection to the CloudNAT IP address to reach the instance. Option B. Add all instances to an unmanaged instance group. Configure TCP proxy load balancing with the instance group as a backend. Connect to the instance using the TCP proxy IP. Option C. Configure Identity-Aware Proxy (IAP) for the instance and ensure that you have the role of IAP Secured Tunnel User. Use the gcloud command line tool to SSH into the instance. Option D. Create a bastion host in the network to SSH into the bastion host from your office location. From the bastion host, SSH into the desired instance. Your customer wants to do resilience testing of their authentication layer. This consists of a regional managed instance group serving a public REST API that reads from and writes to a Cloud SQL instance. What should you do? Option A. Engage with a security company to run web scrapers that look for users' authentication data on malicious websites and notify you if any is found. Option B. Deploy intrusion detection software to your virtual machines to detect and log unauthorized access. Option C. Schedule a disaster simulation exercise during which you can shut off all VMs in a zone to see how your application behaves. Option D. Configure a read replica for your Cloud SQL instance in a different zone than the master, and then manually trigger a failover while monitoring KPIs for our REST API. Your company wants you to build a highly reliable web application with a few public APIs as the backend. You don't expect a lot of user traffic, but traffic could spike occasionally. You want to leverage cloud load balancing, and the solution must be cost-effective for users. What should you do? Option A. Store static content such as HTML and images in Cloud CDN. Host the APIs on App Engine and store the user data in Cloud SQL. Option B. Store static content such as HTML and images in a cloud storage bucket. Host the APIs on a zonal Google Kubernetes Engine cluster with worker nodes in multiple zones, and save the user data in Cloud Spanner. Option C. Store static content such as HTML and images in Cloud CDN. Use Cloud Run to host the APIs and save the user data in Cloud SQL. Option D. Store static content such as HTML and images in a cloud storage bucket. Use Cloud Functions to host the APIs and save the user data in Firestore. You write a Python script to connect to Google BigQuery from a Google Compute Engine virtual machine. The script is printing errors that it cannot connect to BigQuery. What should you do to fix the script? Option A. Install the latest BigQuery API client library for Python. Option B. Run your script on a new virtual machine with the BigQuery access scope enabled. Option C. Create a new service account with BigQuery access and execute your script with that user. Option D. Install the BQ component for gCloud with the command gCloud components install BQ. Your team will start developing a new application using microservices architecture on Kubernetes Engine. As part of the development lifecycle, any code change that has been pushed to the remote develop branch on your GitHub repository should be built and tested automatically. When the build and test are successful, the relevant microservice will be deployed automatically in the development environment. You want to ensure that all code deployed in the development environment follows this process. What should you do? Option A. Have each developer install a pre-commit hook on their workstation that tests the code and builds the container when committing on the development branch. After a successful commit, have the developer deploy the newly built container image on the development cluster. Option B. Install a post-commit hook on the remote Git repository that tests the code and builds the container when code is pushed to the development branch. After a successful commit, have the developer deploy the newly built container image on the development cluster. Option C. Create a cloud build trigger based on the development branch that tests the code, builds the container, and stores it in Container Registry. Create a deployment pipeline that watches for new images and deploys the new image on the development cluster. Ensure only the deployment tool has access to deploy new versions. Option D. Create a cloud build trigger based on the development branch to build a new container image and store it in Container Registry. Rely on vulnerability scanning to ensure the code tests succeed. As the final step of the cloud build process, deploy the new container image on the development cluster. Ensure only Cloud Build has access to deploying new versions. You need to deploy a stateful workload on Google Cloud. The workload can scale horizontally, but each instance needs to read and write to the same POSIX file system. At high load, the stateful workload needs to support up to 100 megabytes per second of writes. What should you do? Option A. Use a persistent disk for each instance. Option B. Use a regional persistent disk for each instance. Option C. Create a cloud file store instance and mount it in each instance. Option D. Create a cloud storage bucket and mount it in each instance using GCS Fuse. You have an application that runs in Google Kubernetes Engine, GKE. Over the last 2 weeks, customers have reported that a specific part of the application returns errors very frequently. You currently have no logging or monitoring solution enabled on your GKE cluster. You want to diagnose the problem, but you have not been able to replicate the issue. You want to cause minimal disruption to the application. What should you do? Option A. 1. Update your GKE cluster to use cloud operations for GKE. 2. Use the GKE monitoring dashboard to investigate logs from affected pods. Option B. 1. Create a new GKE cluster with cloud operations for GKE enabled. 2. Migrate the affected pods to the new cluster and redirect traffic for those pods to the new cluster. 3. Use the GKE monitoring dashboard to investigate logs from affected pods. Option C. 1. Update your GKE cluster to use cloud operations for GKE and deploy Prometheus. 2. Set an alert to trigger whenever the application returns an error. Option D. 1. Create a new GKE cluster with cloud operations for GKE enabled and deploy Prometheus. 2. Migrate the affected pods to the new cluster and redirect traffic for those pods to the new cluster. 3. Set an alert to trigger whenever the application returns an error. You need to migrate Hadoop jobs for your company's data science team without modifying the underlying infrastructure. You want to minimize costs and infrastructure management effort. What should you do? Option A. Create a Dataproc cluster using standard worker instances. Option B. Create a Dataproc cluster using preemptible worker instances. Option C. Manually deploy a Hadoop cluster on Compute Engine using standard instances. Option D. Manually deploy a Hadoop cluster on Compute Engine using preemptible instances. You are using a single Cloud SQL instance to serve your application from a specific zone. You want to introduce high availability. What should you do? Option A. Create a read replica instance in a different region. Option B. Create a failover replica instance in a different region. Option C. Create a read replica instance in the same region, but in a different zone. Option D. Create a failover replica instance in the same region, but in a different zone. You need to upload files from your on-premises environment to cloud storage. You want the files to be encrypted on cloud storage using customer-supplied encryption keys. What should you do? Option A. Supply the encryption key in a BOTO configuration file. Use gsutil to upload the files. Option B. Supply the encryption key using GreekCloud config. Use gsutil to upload the files to that bucket. Option C. Use gsutil to upload the files and use the flag encryption key to supply the encryption key. Option D. Use gsutil to create a bucket and use the flag encryption key to supply the encryption key. Use gsutil to upload the files to that bucket. You need to evaluate your team readiness for a new GCP project. You must perform the evaluation and create a skills gap plan which incorporates the business goal of cost optimization. Your team has deployed 2 GCP projects successfully to date. What should you do? Option A. Allocate budget for team training. Set a deadline for the new GCP project. Option B. Allocate budget for team training. Create a roadmap for your team to achieve Google Cloud certification based on job role. Option C. Allocate budget to hire skilled external consultants. Set a deadline for the new GCP project. Option D. Allocate budget to hire skilled external consultants. Create a roadmap for your team to achieve Google Cloud certification based on job role. The operations team in your company wants to save Cloud VPN log events for 1 year. You need to configure the cloud infrastructure to save the logs. What should you do? Option A. Set up a filter in cloud logging and a cloud storage bucket as an export target for the logs you want to save. Option B. Enable the Compute Engine API and then enable logging on the firewall rules that match the traffic you want to save. Option C. Set up a cloud logging dashboard titled Cloud VPN Logs, and then add a chart that queries for the VPN metrics over a 1-year time period. Option D. Set up a filter in cloud logging and a topic in PubSub to publish the logs. Meltkert Games needs to create a repeatable and configurable mechanism for deploying isolated application environments. Developers and testers can access each other's environments and resources, but they cannot access staging or production resources. The staging environment needs access to some services from production. What should you do to isolate development environments from staging and production? Option A. Create a project for development and test, and another for staging and production. Option B. Create a network for development and test, and another for staging and production. Option C. Create one subnetwork for development, and another for staging and production. Option D. Create one project for development, a second for staging, and a third for production. Your company plans to migrate a multi-petabyte dataset to the cloud. The dataset must be available 24 hours a day. Your business analysts have experience only with using a SQL interface. How should you store the data to optimize it for ease of analysis? Option A. Load data into Google BigQuery. Option B. Insert data into Google Cloud SQL. Option C. Put flat files into Google Cloud Storage. Option D. Stream data into Google Cloud Data Store. All Compute Engine instances in your VPC should be able to connect to an Active Directory server on specific ports. Any other traffic emerging from your instances is not allowed. You want to enforce this using VPC firewall rules. How should you configure the firewall rules? Option A. Create an egress rule with priority 1000 to deny all traffic for all instances. Create another egress rule with priority 100 to allow the Active Directory traffic for all instances. Option B. Create an egress rule with priority 100 to deny all traffic for all instances. Create another egress rule with priority 1000 to allow the Active Directory traffic for all instances. Option C. Create an egress rule with priority 1000 to allow the Active Directory traffic. Rely on the implied deny egress rule with priority 100 to block all traffic for all instances. Option D. Create an egress rule with priority 100 to allow the Active Directory traffic. Rely on the implied deny egress rule with priority 1000 to block all traffic for all instances. To reduce costs, the Director of Engineering has required all developers to move their development infrastructure resources from on-premises virtual machines, VMs, to Google Cloud Platform. These resources go through multiple start-stop events during the day and require state to persist. You have been asked to design the process of running a development environment in Google Cloud while providing cost visibility to the finance department. Which 2 steps should you take? Choose 2. Option A. Use the No Auto Delete flag on all persistent disks and stop the VM. Option B. Use the Auto Delete flag on all persistent disks and terminate the VM. Option C. Apply VM CPU utilization label and include it in the BigQuery billing export. Option D. Use Google BigQuery billing export and labels to associate cost to groups. Option E. Store all state into local SSD. Snapshot the persistent disks and terminate the VM. Option F. Store all state in Google Cloud Storage. Snapshot the persistent disks and terminate the VM. Your company has a stateless web API that performs scientific calculations. The web API runs on a single Google Kubernetes Engine (GKE) cluster. The cluster is currently deployed in a central one. Your company has expanded to offer your API to customers in Asia. You want to reduce the latency for users in Asia. What should you do? Option A. Create a second GKE cluster in Asia Southeast 1 and expose both APIs using a service of type load balancer. Add the public IPs to the Cloud DNS zone. Option B. Use a global HTTP's load balancer with Cloud CDN enabled. Option C. Create a second GKE cluster in Asia Southeast 1 and use Kubemshi to create a global HTTP's load balancer. Option D. Increase the memory and CPU allocated to the application in the cluster. You need to set up Microsoft SQL Server on GCP. Management requires that there's no downtime in case of a data center outage in any of the zones within a GCP region. What should you do? Option A. Configure a Cloud SQL instance with high availability enabled. Option B. Configure a Cloud Spanner instance with a regional instance configuration. Option C. Set up SQL Server on Compute Engine using always on availability groups using Windows failover clustering. Place nodes in different subnets. Option D. Set up SQL Server always on availability groups using Windows failover clustering. Place nodes in different zones. Your company has an enterprise application running on Compute Engine that requires high availability and high performance. The application has been deployed on 2 instances in 2 zones in the same region in active-passive mode. The application writes data to a persistent disk. In the case of a single zone outage, that data should be immediately made available to the other instance in the other zone. You want to maximize performance while minimizing downtime and data loss. What should you do? Option A. 1. Attach a persistent SSD disk to the first instance. 2. Create a snapshot every hour. 3. In case of a zone outage, recreate a persistent SSD disk in the second instance, where data is coming from the created snapshot. Option B. 1. Create a cloud storage bucket. 2. Mount the bucket into the first instance with GCS Fuse. 3. In case of a zone outage, Mount the cloud storage bucket to the second instance with GCS-Fuse. Option C. 1. Attach a regional SSD persistent disk to the first instance. 2. In case of a zone outage, force attach the disk to the other instance. Option D. 1. Attach a local SSD to the first instance disk. 2. Execute an RSYNC command every hour where the target is a persistent SSD disk attached to the second instance. 3. In case of a zone outage, use the second instance. Your company has sensitive data in cloud storage buckets. Data analysts have Identity Access Management (IAM) permissions to read the buckets. You want to prevent data analysts from retrieving the data in the buckets from outside the Office network. What should you do? Option A. 1. Create a VPC service controls perimeter that includes the projects with the buckets. 2. Create an access level with the CIDR of the Office network. Option B. 1. Create a firewall rule for all instances in the Virtual Private Cloud (VPC) network for source range. 2. Use the classless interdomain routing (CIDR) of the Office network. Option C. 1. Create a cloud function to remove IAM permissions from the buckets, and another cloud function to add IAM permissions to the buckets. 2. Schedule the cloud functions with Cloud Scheduler to add permissions at the start of business and remove permissions at the end of business. Option D. 1. Create a cloud VPN to the Office network. 2. Configure private Google access for on-premises hosts. Your company uses the Firewall Insights feature in the Google Network Intelligence Center. You have several firewall rules applied to Compute Engine instances. You need to evaluate the efficiency of the applied firewall rule set. When you bring up the Firewall Insights page in the Google Cloud Console, you notice that there are no log rows to display. What should you do to troubleshoot the issue? Option A. Enable Virtual Private Cloud (VPC) flow logging. Option B. Enable firewall rules logging for the firewall rules you want to monitor. Option C. Verify that your user account is assigned the Compute, Network Admin Identity, and Access Management (IAM) role. Option D. Install the Google Cloud SDK and verify that there are no firewall logs in the command line output. You are moving an application that uses MySQL from on-premises to Google Cloud. The application will run on Compute Engine and will use Cloud SQL. You want to cut over to the Compute Engine deployment of the application with minimal downtime and no data loss to your customers. You want to migrate the application with minimal modification. You also need to determine the cutover strategy. What should you do? Your company is running its application workloads on Compute Engine. The applications have been deployed in production, acceptance, and development environments. The production environment is business critical and is used 24/7, while the acceptance and development environments are only critical during office hours. Your CFO has asked you to optimize these environments to achieve cost savings during idle times. What should you do? Option A. Create a shell script that uses the gullcloud command to change the machine type of the development and acceptance instances to a smaller machine type outside of office hours. Schedule the shell script on one of the production instances to automate the task. Option B. Use Cloud Scheduler to trigger a cloud function that will stop the development and acceptance environments after office hours and start them just before office hours. Option C. Deploy the development and acceptance applications on a managed instance group and enable autoscaling. Option D. Use regular compute engine instances for the production environment and use preemptible VMs for the acceptance and development environments. For this question, refer to the EHR Healthcare case study. You need to define the technical architecture for securely deploying workloads to Google Cloud. You also need to ensure that only verified containers are deployed using Google Cloud services. What should you do? Choose 2. Option A. Enable binary authorization on GKE and sign containers as part of a CI/CD pipeline. Option B. Configure Jenkins to utilize Credis to cryptographically sign a container as part of a CI/CD pipeline. Option C. Configure Container Registry to only allow trusted service accounts to create and deploy containers from the registry. Option D. Configure Container Registry to use vulnerability scanning to confirm that there are no vulnerabilities before deploying the workload. For this question, refer to the EHR Healthcare case study. You are responsible for ensuring that EHR's use of Google Cloud will pass an upcoming privacy compliance audit. What should you do? Choose 2. Option A. Verify EHR's product usage against the list of compliant products on the Google Cloud compliance page. Option B. Advise EHR to execute a Business Associate Agreement (BAA) with Google Cloud. Option C. Use Firebase authentication for EHR's user-facing applications. Option D. Implement Prometheus to detect and prevent security breaches on EHR's web-based applications. Option E. Use GKE private clusters for all Kubernetes workloads. Your company has announced that they will be outsourcing operations functions. You want to allow developers to easily stage new versions of a cloud-based application in the production environment and allow the outsourced operations team to autonomously promote staged versions to production. You want to minimize the operational overhead of the solution. Which Google Cloud product should you migrate to? Option A. App Engine. Option B. GKE On-Prem. Option C. Compute Engine. Option D. Google Kubernetes Engine. For this question, refer to the Mount Kirk Games case study. You are in charge of the new game backend platform architecture. The game communicates with the backend over a REST API. You want to follow Google recommended practices. How should you design the backend? Option A. Create an instance template for the backend. For every region, deploy it on a multi-zone managed instance group. Use an L4 load balancer. Option B. Create an instance template for the backend. For every region, deploy it on a single zone managed instance group. Use an L4 load balancer. Option C. Create an instance template for the backend. For every region, deploy it on a multi-zone managed instance group. Use an L7 load balancer. Option D. Create an instance template for the backend. For every region, deploy it on a single zone managed instance group. Use an L7 load balancer. The Genco Mart security team requires that all Google Cloud Platform infrastructure is deployed using a least privilege model with separation of duties for administration between production and development resources. What Google domain and project structure should you recommend? Option A. Create 2 G Suite accounts to manage users. One for development/test, staging, and one for production. Each account should contain one project for every application. Option B. Create 2 G Suite accounts to manage users. one with a single project for all development applications, and one with a single project for all production applications. Option C. Create a single G Suite account to manage users with each stage of each application in its own project. Option D. Create a single G Suite account to manage users with one project for the development/test/staging environment and one project for the production environment. Your organization requires that metrics from all applications be retained for 5 years for future analysis in possible legal proceedings. Which approach should you use? Option A. Grant the security team access to the logs in each project. Option B. Configure Stackdriver monitoring for all projects and export to BigQuery. Option C. Configure Stackdriver monitoring for all projects with the default retention policies. Option D. Configure Stackdriver monitoring for all projects and export to Google Cloud Storage. Your company operates nationally and plans to use GCP for multiple batch workloads, including some that are not time-critical. You also need to use GCP services that are HIPAA certified and manage service costs. How should you design to meet Google best practices? Option A. Provision preemptible VMs to reduce cost. Discontinue use of all GCP services and APIs that are not HIPAA compliant. Option B. Provision preemptible VMs to reduce cost. Disable and then discontinue use of all GCP services and APIs that are not HIPAA compliant. Option C. Provision standard VMs in the same region to reduce cost. Discontinue use of all GCP services and APIs that are not HIPAA compliant. Option D. Provision standard VMs to the same region to reduce cost. Disable and then discontinue use of all GCP services and APIs that are not HIPAA compliant. You need to develop procedures to verify resilience of disaster recovery for remote recovery using GCP. Your production environment is hosted on-premises. You need to establish a secure, redundant connection between your on-premises network and the GCP network. What should you do? Option A. Verify that dedicated interconnect can replicate files to GCP. Verify that direct peering can establish a secure connection between your networks if dedicated interconnect fails. Option B. Verify that dedicated interconnect can replicate files to GCP. Verify that Cloud VPN can establish a secure connection between your networks if dedicated interconnect fails. Option C. Verify that the transfer appliance can replicate files to GCP. Verify that direct peering can establish a secure connection between your networks if the transfer appliance fails. Option D. Verify that the transfer appliance can replicate files to GCP. Verify that Cloud VPN can establish a secure connection between your networks if the transfer appliance fails. Your company has a Google Cloud project that uses BigQuery for data warehousing on a pay-per-use basis. You want to monitor queries in real time to discover the most costly queries and which users spend the most. What should you do? Option A. 1. In the BigQuery dataset that contains all the tables to be queried, add a label for each user that can launch a query. 2. Open the billing page of the project. 3. Select reports. 4. Select BigQuery as the product and filter by the user you want to check. Option B. 1. Create a cloud logging sync to export BigQuery data access logs to BigQuery. 2. Perform a BigQuery query on the generated table to extract the information you need. Option C. 1. Create a cloud logging sink to export BigQuery data access logs to cloud storage. 2. Develop a data flow pipeline to compute the cost of queries split by users. Option D. 1. Activate billing export into BigQuery. 2. Perform a BigQuery query on the billing table to extract the information you need. Your company has an application running as a deployment in a Google Kubernetes Engine (GKE) cluster. When releasing new versions of the application via a rolling deployment, the team has been causing outages. The root cause of the outages is misconfigurations with parameters that are only used in production. You want to put preventive measures for this in the platform to prevent outages. What should you do? Option A. Configure liveness and readiness probes in the pod specification. Option B. Configure health checks on the managed instance group. Option C. Create a scheduled task to check whether the application is available. Option D. Configure an uptime alert in cloud monitoring. Your company is using BigQuery as its enterprise data warehouse. Data is distributed over several Google Cloud projects. All queries on BigQuery need to be billed on a single project. You want to make sure that no query costs are incurred on the projects that contain the data. Users should be able to query the datasets, but not edit them. How should you configure users' access roles? Option A. Add all users to a group. Grant the group the role of BigQuery user on the billing project and BigQuery data viewer on the projects that contain the data. Option B. Add all users to a group. Grant the group the roles of BigQuery data viewer on the billing project and BigQuery user on the projects that contain the data. Option C. Add all users to a group. Grant the group the roles of BigQuery job user on the billing project and BigQuery data viewer on the projects that contain the data. Option D. Add all users to a group. Grant the group the roles of BigQuery data viewer on the billing project and BigQuery job user on the projects that contain the data. You are working with a data warehousing team that performs data analysis. The team needs to process data from external partners, but the data contains personally identifiable information, PII. You need to process and store the data without storing any of the PII data. What should you do? Option A. Create a data flow pipeline to retrieve the data from the external sources. As part of the pipeline, use the Cloud Data Loss Prevention (Cloud DLP) API to remove any PII data. Store the result in BigQuery. Option B. Create a data flow pipeline to retrieve the data from the external sources. As part of the pipeline, store all non-PII data in BigQuery and store all PII data in a cloud storage bucket that has a retention policy set. Option C. Ask the external partners to upload all data on cloud storage. Configure bucket lock for the bucket. Create a data flow pipeline to read the data from the bucket. As part of the pipeline, use the Cloud Data Loss Prevention (Cloud DLP) API to remove any PII data. Store the result in BigQuery. Option D. Ask the external partners to import all data in your BigQuery dataset. Create a data flow pipeline to copy the data into a new table. As part of the data flow bucket, skip all data in columns and have PII data. Terram Earth plans to connect all 20 million vehicles in the field to the cloud. This increases the volume to 20,600,000 byte records a second for 40 terabytes an hour. How should you design the data ingestion? Option A. Vehicles write data directly to GCS. Option B. Vehicles write data directly to Google Cloud Pub Sub. Option C. Vehicles stream data directly to Google BigQuery. Option D. Vehicles continue to write data using the existing system, FTP. Your company creates rendering software, which users can download from the company website. Your company has customers all over the world. You want to minimize latency for all your customers. You want to follow Google recommended practices. How should you store the files? Option A. Save the files in a multi-regional cloud storage bucket. Option B. Save the files in a regional cloud storage bucket. One bucket per zone of the region. Option C. Save the files in multiple regional cloud storage buckets. One bucket per zone per region. Option D. Save the files in multiple multi-regional cloud storage buckets. One bucket per multi-region. You created a pipeline that can deploy your source code changes to your infrastructure in instance groups for self-healing. One of the changes negatively affects your key performance indicator. You are not sure how to fix it. An investigation could take up to a week. What should you do? Option A. Log into a server and iterate on the Fox locally. Option B. Revert the source code change and rerun the deployment pipeline. Option C. Log into the servers with the bad code change and swap in the previous code. Option D. Change the instance group template to the previous one and delete all instances. You want to establish a compute engine application in a single VPC across two regions. The application must communicate over VPN to an on-premises network. How should you deploy the VPN? Option A. Use VPC network peering between the VPC and the on-premises network. Option B. Expose the VPC to the on-premises network using IAM and VPC sharing. Option C. Create a global cloud VPN gateway with VPN tunnels from each region to the on-premises peer gateway. Option D. Deploy cloud VPN gateway in each region. Ensure that each region has at least one VPN tunnel to the on-premises peer gateway. You analyzed Terramirth's business requirement to reduce downtime and found that they can achieve a majority of time saving by reducing customers' wait time for parts. You decided to focus on reduction of the 3 weeks aggregate reporting time. Which modifications to the company's processes should you recommend? Option A. Migrate from CSV to binary format. Migrate from FTP to SFTP transport and develop machine learning analysis of metrics. Option B. Migrate from FTP to streaming transport. Migrate from CSV to binary format and develop machine learning analysis of metrics. Option C. Increase fleet cellular connectivity to 80%. Migrate from FTP to streaming transport and develop machine learning analysis of metrics. Option D. Migrate from FTP to SFTP transport, develop machine learning analysis of metrics, and increase dealer local inventory by a fixed factor. For this question, refer to the Helicopter Racing League (HRL) case study. HRL wants better prediction accuracy from their ML prediction models. They want you to use Google's AI platform so HRL can understand and interpret the predictions. What should you do? Option A. Use Explainable AI. Option B. Use Vision AI. Option C. Use Google Cloud's Operations Suite. Option D. Use Jupyter Notebooks. Your company captures all web traffic data in Google Analytics 360 and stores it in BigQuery. Each country has its own dataset. Each dataset has multiple tables. You want analysts from each country to be able to see and query only the data for their respective countries. How should you configure the access rights? Option A. Create a group per country. Add analysts to their respective country groups. Create a single group, all_analysts, and add all country groups as members. Grant the all_analyst group the IAM role of BigQuery job user. Share the appropriate dataset with view access with each respective analyst country group. Option B. Create a group per country. Add analysts to their respective country groups. Create a single group, all_analysts, and add all country groups as members. Grant the all_analyst group the IAM role of BigQuery job user. Share the appropriate tables with view access with each respective analyst country group. Option C. Create a group per country. Add analysts to their respective country groups. Create a single group, all_analysts, and add all country groups as members. Grant the all_analyst group the IAM role of BigQuery data viewer. Share the appropriate dataset with view access with each respective analyst country group. Option D. Create a group per country. Add analysts to their respective country groups. Create a single group, all_analysts, and add all country groups as members. Grant the all_analyst group the IAM role of BigQuery data viewer. Share the appropriate table with view access with each respective analyst country group. A development manager is building a new application. He asks you to review his requirements and identify what cloud technologies he can use to meet them. The application must 1. Be based on open-source technology for cloud portability. 2. Dynamically scale compute capacity based on demand. 3. Support continuous software delivery. 4. Run multiple segregated copies of the same application stack. 5. Deploy application bundles using dynamic templates. 6. Route network traffic to specific services based on URL. Which combination of technologies will meet all of his requirements? Option A. Google Kubernetes Engine, Jenkins, and Helm. Option B. Google Kubernetes Engine and Cloud Load Balancing. Option C. Google Kubernetes Engine and Cloud Deployment Manager. Option D. Google Kubernetes Engine, Jenkins, and Cloud Load Balancing. You have an outage in your Compute Engine Managed Instance Group. All instances keep restarting after 5 seconds. You have a health check configured, but autoscaling is disabled. Your colleague, who is a Linux expert, offered to look into the issue. You need to make sure that he can access the VMs. What should you do? Option A. Grant your colleague the IAM role of project viewer. Option B. Perform a rolling restart on the instance group. Option C. Disable the health check for the instance group. Add his SSH key to the project-wide SSH keys. Option D. Disable autoscaling for the instance group. Add his SSH key to the project-wide SSH keys. You need to deploy an application to Google Cloud. The application receives traffic via TCP and reads and writes data to the file system. The application does not support horizontal scaling. The application process requires full control over the data on the file system because concurrent access causes corruption. The business is willing to accept a downtime when an incident occurs, but the application must be available 24/7 to support their business operations. You need to design the architecture of this application on Google Cloud. What should you do? Option A. Use a managed instance group with instances in multiple zones, use Cloud File Store, and use an HTTP load balancer in front of the instances. Option B. Use a managed instance group with instances in multiple zones, use Cloud File Store, and use a network load balancer in front of the instances. Option C. Use an unmanaged instance group with an active and standby instance in different zones, use a regional persistent disk, and use an HTTP load balancer in front of the instances. Option D. Use an unmanaged instance group with an active and standby instance in different zones, use a regional persistent disk, and use a network load balancer in front of the instances. An application development team has come to you for advice. They are planning to write and deploy an HTTPS API using Go 1.12. The API will have a very unpredictable workload and must remain reliable during peaks in traffic. They want to minimize operational overhead for this application. Which approach should you recommend? Option A. Develop the application with containers and deploy to Google Kubernetes Engine. Option B. Develop the application for App Engine Standard Environment. Option C. Use a managed instance group when deploying to Compute Engine. Option D. Develop the application for App Engine Flexible Environment using a custom runtime. Your solution is producing performance bugs in production that you did not see in staging and test environments. You want to adjust your test and deployment procedures to avoid this problem in the future. What should you do? Option A. Deploy fewer changes to production. Option B. Deploy smaller changes to production. Option C. Increase the load on your test and staging environments. Option D. Deploy changes to a small subset of users before rolling out to production. You have developed a non-critical update to your application that is running in a managed instance group and have created a new instance template with the update that you want to release. To prevent any possible impact to the application, you don't want to update any running instances. You want any new instances that are created by the managed instance group to contain the new update. What should you do? Option A. Start a new rolling restart operation. Option B. Start a new rolling replace operation. Option C. Start a new rolling update. Select the proactive update mode. Option D. Start a new rolling update. Select the opportunistic update mode. Your team needs to create a Google Kubernetes Engine (GKE) cluster to host a newly built application that requires access to third-party services on the Internet. Your company does not allow any Compute Engine instance to have a public IP address on Google Cloud. You need to create a deployment strategy that adheres to these guidelines. What should you do? Option A. Configure the GKE cluster as a private cluster and configure CloudNet Gateway for the cluster subnet. Option B. Configure the GKE cluster as a private cluster. Configure private Google access on the Virtual Private Cloud (VPC). Option C. Configure the GKE cluster as a root-based cluster. Configure private Google access on the Virtual Private Cloud (VPC). Option D. Create a Compute Engine instance and install a NAT proxy on the instance. Configure all workloads on GKE to pass through this proxy to access third-party services on the Internet. You set up an auto-scaling instance group to serve web traffic for an upcoming launch. After configuring the instance group as a backend service to an HTTPS load balancer, you notice that virtual machine (VM) instances are being terminated and relaunched every minute. The instances do not have a public IP address. You have verified the appropriate web response is coming from each instance using the curl command. You want to ensure the backend is configured correctly. What should you do? Option A. Ensure that a firewall rules exist to allow source traffic on HTTPS to reach the load balancer. Option B. Assign a public IP to each instance and configure a firewall rule to allow the load balancer to reach the instance public IP. Option C. Ensure that a firewall rule exists to allow load balancer health checks to reach the instances in the instance group. Option D. Create a tag on each instance with the name of the load balancer. Configure a firewall rule with the name of the load balancer as the source and the instance tag as the destination. Your customer is moving an existing corporate application to Google Cloud Platform from an on-premises data center. The business owners require minimal user disruption. There are strict security team requirements for storing passwords. What authentication strategy should they use? Option A. Use G Suite Password Sync to replicate passwords into Google. Option B. Federate authentication via SAML 2.0 to the existing identity provider. Option C. Provision users in Google using the Google Cloud Directory Sync tool. Option D. Ask users to set their Google password to match their corporate password. Your company has a networking team and a development team. The development team runs applications on Compute Engine instances that contain sensitive data. The development team requires administrative permissions for Compute Engine. Your company requires all network resources to be managed by the networking team. The development team does not want the networking team to have access to the sensitive data on the instances. What should you do? Option A. 1. Create a project with a standalone VPC and assign the network admin role to the networking team. 2. Create a second project with a standalone VPC and assign the compute admin role to the development team. 3. Use Cloud VPN to join the two VPCs. Option B. 1. Create a project with a standalone virtual private cloud VPC. Assign the network admin role to the networking team and assign the compute admin role to the development team. Option C. 1. Create a project with a shared VPC and assign the network admin role to the networking team. 2. Create a second project without a VPC, configure it as a shared VPC service project, and assign the compute admin role to the development team. Option D. 1. Create a project with a standalone VPC and assign the network admin role to the networking team. 2. Create a second project with a standalone VPC and assign the compute admin role to the development team. 3. Use VPC peering to join the two VPCs. You are implementing the infrastructure for a web service on Google Cloud. The web service needs to receive and store the data from 500,000 requests per second. The data will be queried later in real time, based on exact matches of a known set of attributes. There will be periods where the web service will not receive any requests. The business wants to keep costs low. Which web service platform and database should you use for the application? Option A. Cloud Run and BigQuery. Option B. Cloud Run and Cloud Bigtable. Option C. A Compute Engine Autoscaling Managed Instance Group and BigQuery. Option D. A Compute Engine Autoscaling Managed Instance Group and Cloud Bigtable. To speed up data retrieval, more vehicles will be upgraded to cellular connections and be able to transmit data to the ETL process. The current FTP process is error-prone and restarts the data transfer from the start of the file when connections fail, which happens often. You want to improve the reliability of the solution and minimize data transfer time on the cellular connections. What should you do? Auditors visit your teams every 12 months and ask to review all the Google Cloud Identity and Access Management (Cloud IAM) policy changes in the previous 12 months. You want to streamline and expedite the analysis and audit process. What should you do? Option A. Create custom Google Stackdriver alerts and send them to the auditor. Option B. Enable logging export to Google BigQuery and use ACLs and views to scope the data shared with the auditor. Option C. Use Cloud Functions to transfer log entries to Google Cloud SQL and use ACLs and views to limit an auditor's view. Option D. Enable Google Cloud Storage (GCS) log export to audit logs into a GCS bucket and delegate access to the bucket. During a high-traffic portion of the day, one of your relational databases crashes, but the replica is never promoted to a master. You want to avoid this in the future. What should you do? Option A. Use a different database. Option B. Choose larger instances for your database. Option C. Create snapshots of your database more regularly. Option D. Implement routinely scheduled failovers of your databases. Your company has a Kubernetes application that pulls messages from pub/sub and stores them in FileStore. Because the application is simple, it was deployed as a single pod. The infrastructure team has analyzed pub/sub metrics and discovered that the application cannot process the messages in real time. Most of them wait for minutes before being processed. You need to scale the elaboration process that is I/O intensive. What should you do? Option A. Use kubect-l autoscale deployment app_name max 6 min 2 CPU %50 to configure Kubernetes autoscaling deployment. Option B. Configure a Kubernetes autoscaling deployment based on the subscription/push_request_latencies metric. Option C. Use the enable autoscaling flag when you create the Kubernetes cluster. Option D. Configure a Kubernetes autoscaling deployment based on the subscription/num_undelivered_messages metric. You are developing a globally scaled front-end for a legacy streaming back-end data API. This API expects events in strict chronological order with no repeat data for proper processing. Which products should you deploy to ensure guaranteed once FIFO, first in, first out, delivery of data? Option A. Cloud Pub/Sub alone. Option B. Cloud Pub/Sub to Cloud Dataflow. Option C. Cloud Pub/Sub to Stackdriver. Option D. Cloud Pub/Sub to Cloud SQL. Dress4Win has configured a new uptime check with Google Stackdriver for several of their legacy services. The Stackdriver dashboard is not reporting the services as healthy. What should they do? Option A. Install the Stackdriver agent on all of the legacy web servers. Option B. In the Cloud Platform console, download the list of the uptime servers' IP addresses and create an inbound firewall rule. Option C. Configure their load balancer to pass through the user agent HTTP header when the value matches Google Stackdriver monitoring uptime checks. https://cloud.google.com/monitoring option D. Configure their legacy web servers to allow requests that contain user agent HTTP header when the value matches Google Stackdriver monitoring uptime checks. https://cloud.google.com Dress4Win would like to become familiar with deploying applications to the cloud by successfully deploying some applications quickly, as is. They have asked for your recommendation. What should you advise? Option A. Identify self-contained applications with external dependencies as a first move to the cloud. Option B. Identify enterprise applications with internal dependencies and recommend these as a first move to the cloud. Option C. Suggest moving their in-house databases to the cloud and continue serving requests to on-premise applications. Option D. Recommend moving their message queuing servers to the cloud and continue handling requests to on-premise applications. As part of Dress4Win's plans to migrate to the cloud, they want to be able to set up a managed logging and monitoring system so they can handle spikes in their traffic load. They want to ensure that the infrastructure can be notified when it needs to scale up and down to handle the ebb and flow of usage throughout the day. Their administrators are notified automatically when their application reports errors. They can filter their aggregated logs down in order to debug one piece of the application across many hosts. Which Google Stackdriver features should they use? Option A. Logging, alerts, insights, debug. Option B. Monitoring, trace, debug, logging. Option C. Monitoring, logging, alerts, error reporting. Option D. Monitoring, logging, debug, error report. The Dress4Win security team has disabled external SSH access into production virtual machines, VMs, on Google Cloud Platform, GCP. The operations team needs to remotely manage the VMs, build and push Docker containers, and manage Google Cloud Storage objects. What can they do? Option A. Grant the operations engineer access to use Google Cloud Shell. Option B. Configure a VPN connection to GCP to the cloud SSH access to the cloud VMs. Option C. Develop a new access request process that grants temporary SSH access to cloud VMs when an operations engineer needs to perform a task. Option D. Have the development team build an API service that allows the operations team to execute specific remote procedure calls to accomplish their tasks. For this question, refer to the Dress4Win case study. Dress4Win is expected to grow to 10 times its size in 1 year, with a corresponding growth in data and traffic that mirrors the existing patterns of usage. The CIO has set the target of migrating production infrastructure to the cloud within the next 6 months. How will you configure the solution to scale for this growth without making major application changes and still maximize the ROI? Option A. Migrate the web application layer to App Engine and MySQL to Cloud Data Store and NAS to cloud storage. Deploy RabbitMQ and deploy Hadoop servers using Deployment Manager. Option B. Migrate RabbitMQ to Cloud Pub Sub, Hadoop to BigQuery, and NAS to Compute Engine with persistent disk storage. Deploy Tomcat and deploy Nginx using Deployment Manager. Option C. Implement managed instance groups for Tomcat and Nginx. Migrate MySQL to Cloud SQL, RabbitMQ to Cloud Pub Sub, Hadoop to Cloud Dataproc, and NAS to Compute Engine with persistent disk storage. Option D. Implement managed instance groups for the Tomcat and Nginx. Migrate MySQL to CloudSQL, RabbitMQ to Cloud Pub Sub, Hadoop to Cloud Dataproc, and NAS to Cloud Storage. Your company has an application running on App Engine that allows users to upload music files and share them with other people. You want to allow users to upload files directly into cloud storage from their browser session. The payload should not be passed through the back end. What should you do? Option A. 1. Set a CoreOS configuration in the target cloud storage bucket, where the base URL of the App Engine application is an allowed origin. 2. Use the Cloud Storage Signed URL feature to generate a post URL. Option B. 1. Set a CoreOS configuration in the target cloud storage bucket, where the base URL of the App Engine application is an allowed origin. 2. Assign the Cloud Storage Writer role to users who upload files. Option C. 1. Use the Cloud Storage Signed URL feature to generate a post URL. 2. Use App Engine default credentials to sign requests against cloud storage. Option D. 1. Assign the Cloud Storage Writer role to users who upload files. 2. Use App Engine default credentials to sign requests against cloud storage. Your company is planning to migrate their Windows Server 2022 from their on-premises data center to Google Cloud. You need to bring the licenses that are currently in use in on-premises virtual machines into the target cloud environment. What should you do? Option A. 1. Create an image of the on-premises virtual machines and upload into cloud storage. 2. Import the image as a virtual disk on Compute Engine. Option B. 1. Create standard instances on Compute Engine. 2. Select as the OS the same Microsoft Windows version that is currently in use in the on-premises environment. Option C. 1. Create an image of the on-premises virtual machine. 2. Import the image as a virtual disk on Compute Engine. 3. Create a standard instance on Compute Engine, selecting as the OS the same Microsoft Windows version that is currently in use in the on-premises environment. 4. Attach a data disk that includes data that matches the created image. Option D. 1. Create an image of the on-premises virtual machines. 2. Import the image as a virtual disk on Compute Engine using OS equals Windows 2022 DCV less than timestamp greater than. 3. Create a sole tenancy instance on Compute Engine that uses the imported disk as a boot disk less than / timestamp greater than. You have a Python web application with many dependencies that requires 0.1 CPU cores and 128 megabytes of memory to operate in production. You want to monitor and maximize machine utilization. You also want to reliably deploy new versions of the application. Which set of steps should you take? For this question, refer to the Tarim Earth case study. Tarim Earth has about 1 petabyte (PB) of vehicle testing data in a private data center. You want to move the data to cloud storage for your machine learning team. Currently, a 1 gigabit per second interconnect link is available for you. The machine learning team wants to start using the data in a month. What should you do? Option A. Request transfer appliances from Google Cloud, export the data to appliances, and return the appliances to Google Cloud. Option B. Configure the storage transfer service from Google Cloud to send the data from your data center to cloud storage. Option C. Make sure there are no other users consuming the 1 gigabit per second link, and use multi-thread transfer to upload the data to cloud storage. Option D. Export files to an encrypted USB device. Send the device to Google Cloud and request an import of the data to cloud storage. Your organization has decided to restrict the use of external IP addresses on instances to only approved instances. You want to enforce this requirement across all of your virtual private clouds, VPCs. What should you do? Option A. Remove the default route on all VPCs. Move all approved instances into a new subnet that has a default route to an internet gateway. Option B. Create a new VPC in custom mode. Create a new subnet for the approved instances and set a default route to the internet gateway on this new subnet. Option C. Implement a Cloud NAT solution to remove the need for external IP addresses entirely. Option D. Set an organization policy with a constraint on constraints/compute VM external IP access. List the approved instances in the allowed values list. You are designing an application for use only during business hours. For the minimum viable product release, you'd like to use a managed product that automatically scales to zero so you don't incur costs when there is no activity. Which primary compute resource should you choose? Option A. Cloud Functions. Option B. Compute Engine. Option C. Google Kubernetes Engine. Option D. App Engine Flexible Environment. You are using Cloud CDN to deliver static HTTPS website content hosted on a Compute Engine instance group. You want to improve the cache hit ratio. What should you do? Option A. Customize the cache keys to omit the protocol from the key. Option B. Shorten the expiration time of the cached objects. Option C. Make sure the HTTPS header cache region points to the closest region of your users. Option D. Replicate the static content in a cloud storage bucket. Point Cloud CDN toward a load balancer on that bucket. Your organization has a 3-tier web application deployed in the same network on Google Cloud Platform. Each tier, web, API, and database, scales independently of the others. Network traffic should flow through the web to the API tier and then on to the database tier. Traffic should not flow between the web and the database tier. How should you configure the network? Option A. Add each tier to a different subnetwork. Option B. Set up software-based firewalls on individual VMs. Option C. Add tags to each tier and set up routes to allow the desired traffic flow. Option D. Add tags to each tier and set up firewall rules to allow the desired traffic flow. You have created several preemptible Linux virtual machine instances using Google Compute Engine. You want to properly shut down your application before the virtual machines are preempted. What should you do? Option A. Create a shutdown script named K99. Shutdown in the etc. RC.6 D directory. Option B. Create a shutdown script registered as a Zinet D service in Linux and configure a Stackdriver endpoint check to call the service. Option C. Create a shutdown script and use it as the value for a new metadata entry with the key shutdown script in the Cloud Platform console when you create the new virtual machine instance. Option D. Create a shutdown script, registered as a ZinetD service in Linux, and use the GRE Cloud Compute instances add metadata command to specify the service URL as the value for a new metadata entry with the key shutdown script URL. Your agricultural division is experimenting with fully autonomous vehicles. You want your architecture to promote strong security during vehicle operation. Which two architectures should you consider? Choose two. Option A. Treat every microservice call between modules on the vehicle as untrusted. Option B. Require IPv6 for connectivity to ensure a secure address space. Option C. Use a trusted platform module, TPM, and verify firmware and binaries on boot. Option D. Use a functional programming language to isolate code execution cycles. Option E. Use multiple connectivity subsystems for redundancy. Option F. Enclose the vehicle's drive electronics in a Faraday cage to isolate chips. Your applications will be writing their logs to BigQuery for analysis. Each application should have its own table. Any logs older than 45 days should be removed. You want to optimize storage and follow Google recommended practices. What should you do? Option A. Configure the expiration time for your tables at 45 days. Option B. Make the tables time partitioned and configure the partition expiration at 45 days. Option C. Rely on BigQuery's default behavior to prune application logs older than 45 days. Option D. Create a script that uses the BigQuery command line tool, BQ, to remove records older than 45 days. You are helping the QA team to roll out a new load testing tool to test the scalability of your primary cloud services that run on Google Compute Engine with Cloud Bigtable. Which three requirements should they include? Choose 3. Option A. Ensure that the load tests validate the performance of Cloud Bigtable. Option B. Create a separate Google Cloud project to use for the load testing environment. Option C. Schedule the load testing tool to regularly run against the production environment. Option D. Ensure all third-party systems your services use is capable of handling high load. Option E. Instrument the production services to record every transaction for replay by the load testing tool. Option F. Instrument the load testing tool and the target services with detailed logging and metrics collection. Your company's user feedback portal comprises a standard LAMP stack replicated across 2 zones. It is deployed in the U.S. Central 1 region and uses autoscaled managed instance groups on all layers, except the database. Currently, only a small group of select customers have access to the portal. The portal meets a 99% availability SLA under these conditions. However, next quarter, your company will be making the portal available to all users, including unauthenticated users. You need to develop a resiliency testing strategy to ensure the system maintains the SLA once they introduce additional user load. What should you do? Option A. Capture existing users' input and replay captured user load until autoscale is triggered on all layers. At the same time, terminate all resources in one of the zones. Option B. Create synthetic random user input. Replay synthetic load until autoscale logic is triggered on at least one layer, and introduce OEuro chaos OEuro to the system by terminating random resources on both zones. Option C. Expose the new system to a larger group of users, and increase group size each day until autoscale logic is triggered on all layers. At the same time, terminate random resources on both zones. Option D. Capture existing users' input and replay captured user load until resource utilization crosses 80%. Also, derive estimated number of users based on existing users' usage of the app and deploy enough resources to handle 200% of expected load. You want to optimize the performance of an accurate, real-time weather charting application. The data comes from 50,000 sensors sending 10 readings a second in the format of a timestamp and sensor reading. Where should you store the data? Option A. Google BigQuery. Option B. Google Cloud SQL. Option C. Google Cloud Bigtable. Option D. Google Cloud Storage. You are tasked with building an online analytical processing, OLAP, marketing analytics, and reporting tool. This requires a relational database that can operate on hundreds of terabytes of data. What is the Google recommended tool for such applications? Option A. Cloud Spanner, because it is globally distributed. Option B. Cloud SQL, because it is a fully managed relational database. Option C. Cloud Firestore, because it offers real-time synchronization across devices. Option D. BigQuery, because it is designed for large-scale processing of tabular data. You are building a continuous deployment pipeline for a project stored in a Git source repository and want to ensure that code changes can be verified before deploying to production. What should you do? Option A. Use Spinnaker to deploy builds to production using the red-black deployment strategy so that changes can easily be rolled back. Option B. Use Spinnaker to deploy builds to production and run tests on production deployments. Option C. Use Jenkins to build the staging branches and the master branch. Build and deploy changes to production for 10% of users before doing a complete rollout. Option D. Use Jenkins to monitor tags in the repository. Deploy staging tags to a staging environment for testing. After testing, tag the repository for production and deploy that to the production environment. You need to reduce the number of unplanned rollbacks of erroneous production deployments in your company's web hosting platform. Improvement to the QA test processes accomplished an 80% reduction. Which additional 2 approaches can you take to further reduce the rollbacks? Choose 2. Option A. Introduce a green-blue deployment model. Option B. Replace the QA environment with canary releases. Option C. Fragment the monolithic platform into microservices. Option D. Reduce the platform's dependency on relational database systems. Option E. Replace the platform's relational database systems with a NoSQL database. Your customer wants to capture multiple GBs of aggregate real-time key performance indicators, KPIs, from their game servers running on Google Cloud Platform and monitor the KPIs with low latency. How should they capture the KPIs? Option A. Store time series data from the game servers in Google Bigtable and view it using Google Data Studio. Option B. Output custom metrics to Stackdriver from the game servers and create a dashboard in Stackdriver Monitoring Console to view them. Option C. Schedule BigQuery load jobs to ingest analytics files uploaded to cloud storage every 10 minutes and visualize the results in Google Data Studio. Option D. Insert the KPIs into Cloud Data Store entities and run ad hoc analysis and visualizations of them in Cloud Data Lab. Your company has just recently activated Cloud Identity to manage users. The Google Cloud organization has been configured as well. The security team needs to secure projects that will be part of the organization. They want to prohibit IAM users outside the domain from gaining permissions from now on. What should they do? Option A. Configure an organization policy to restrict identities by domain. Option B. Configure an organization policy to block creation of service accounts. Option C. Configure Cloud Scheduler to trigger a cloud function every hour that removes all users that don't belong to the Cloud Identity domain from all projects. Option D. Create a technical user, e.g., email@example.com, and give it the project owner role at root organization level. Write a bash script that Eurocent lists all the IAM rules of all projects within the organization. Eurocent deletes all users that do not belong to the company domain. Create a Compute Engine instance in a project within the organization and configure Cloud to be executed with technical user credentials. Configure a cron job that executes the bash script every hour. For this question, refer to the Helicopter Racing League (HRL) case study. Your team is in charge of creating a payment card data vault for card numbers used to bill tens of thousands of viewers, merchandise consumers, and season ticket holders. You need to implement a custom card tokenization service that meets the following requirements. Asterisk. It must provide low latency at minimal cost. Asterisk. It must be able to identify duplicate credit cards and must not store plaintext card numbers. Asterisk. It should support annual key rotation. Which storage approach should you adopt for your tokenization service? Option A. Store the card data in Secret Manager after running a query to identify duplicates. Option B. Encrypt the card data with a deterministic algorithm stored in Firestore using data store mode. Option C. Encrypt the card data with a deterministic algorithm and shard it across multiple memory store instances. Option D. Use column-level encryption to store the data in Cloud SQL. You want to allow your operations team to store logs from all the production projects in your organization, without including logs from other projects. All of the production projects are contained in a folder. You want to ensure that all logs for existing and new production projects are captured automatically. What should you do? Option A. Create an aggregated export on the production folder. Set the log sync to be a cloud storage bucket in an operations project. Option B. Create an aggregated export on the organization resource. Set the log sync to be a cloud storage bucket in an operations project. Option C. Create log exports in the production projects. Set the log syncs to be a cloud storage bucket in an operations project. Option D. Create log exports in the production projects. Set the log syncs to be BigQuery datasets in the production projects, and grant IAM access to the operations team to run queries on the datasets. You are configuring the cloud network architecture for a newly created project in Google Cloud that will host applications in Compute Engine. Compute Engine virtual machine instances will be created in two different subnets, Sub A and Sub B, within a single region. Instances in Sub A will have public IP addresses. Instances in Sub B will have only private IP addresses. To download updated packages, instances must connect to a public repository outside the boundaries of Google Cloud. You need to allow Sub B to access the external repository. What should you do? Option A. Enable private Google access on Sub B. Option B. Configure Cloud NAT and select Sub B in the NAT mapping section. Option C. Configure a Bastion host instance in sub A to connect to instances in sub B. Option D. Enable identity-aware proxy for TCP forwarding for instances in sub B. Your BigQuery project has several users. For audit purposes, you need to see how many queries each user ran in the last month. What should you do? Option A. Connect Google Data Studio to BigQuery. Create a dimension for the users and a metric for the amount of queries per user. Option B. In the BigQuery interface, execute a query on the JOBS table to get the required information. Option C. Use BQShow to list all jobs. Per job, use BQLs to list job information and get the required information. Option D. Use Cloud Audit Logging to view Cloud Audit logs, and create a filter on the query operation to get the required information. Your operations team currently stores 10 terabytes of data in an object storage service from a third-party provider. They want to move this data to a cloud storage bucket as quickly as possible, following Google recommended practices. They want to minimize the cost of this data migration. Which approach should they use? Option A. Use the gsutil-mv command to move the data. Option B. Use the storage transfer service to move the data. Option C. Download the data to a transfer appliance and ship it to Google. Option D. Download the data to the on-premises data center and upload it to the cloud storage bucket.